So Not Nowhere is an artist workers cooperative. We inherited quite a sizable amount of 16 millimeter and Super 8 equipment from the folks at Nowhere, who some of you may have already know. And kind of what we're just really interested in doing is kind of using that language that we already sort of understand, maybe my collaborator Imran a bit more than myself, in terms of film and video, to kind of facilitate being able to address some of the material conditions of being a Black or a POC artist in this city. So we're already doing workshops, of which on your little handout there's like a little schedule for some things that are coming out, in case anyone's interested. Some screenings, some exhibitions, and things like this. A bit on the kind of cooperative structure. I mean, I won't spend too long talking about that, but I'll just sort of like flag that I'm available to talk about that in case anyone has any questions. But one thing that I will sort of highlight is that we've decided to establish basically a flat pay rate of £25 an hour for all work across the cooperative, which essentially means that if you're sort of working to do some admin, help us with our accounts. I'm really bad with numbers, please help. Or, do some other kinds of work, or to organize a screening or an exhibition, that pay rate is the same. And we're also kind of setting up a system in which, just basically making the kind of path to sort of voting membership in the cooperative quite clear. So that will basically start for a person after 100 hours of work with the cooperative. You could then pursue a voting membership. We're also, just a quick plug, really interested in Black and POC artists running workshops, doing like various types of admins. We're really interested in providing kind of secondary income streams for artists, and where possible, training people to be able to use the equipment, with the view to sort of, I guess, acknowledging that this equipment that we've inherited kind of comes with this very sort of democratic heritage, but when 3 minutes of film is £50, kind of also acknowledging that that's not really the case as it maybe once was in the sort of heyday of 60 millimeter film in the 70s, even though it is still really beautiful to deal with. I'm not denying that, any 16 millimeter fans here. So basically, as part of that, I just wanted to mention that as part of this event, actually, we are getting Rabz, with the wonderful support of Lux and BFI, we are getting Rabz trained in using Super 8, with a view to the fact that if Rabz wants, Rabz will be able to run a Super 8 class at Not Nowhere in the future. And that sort of thing is something that we're really interested in doing more of. So if you are interested in doing that, email me, taylor@notnowhere.org. And then I guess kind of why I wanted to have this conversation. Well, I think one of the things that the cooperative is really concerned about is sort of this idea of like owning means of production, thinking really critically about what our labor in the arts industry is sort of worth in terms of the value of that labor. And also wanting to kind of talk a little bit more about like when we engage in labor that feels extractive or exploitative or unsafe, that we sort of kind of are acknowledging and talking about why we're also participating in those, or why we may want to or still need to participate in those exchanges. So like what else is being exchanged other than monetary gain? So then that kind of brings us to this issue of representation, which is actually something that I started talking to Rabz about sort of outside of an opening, and it was this weird kind of like recognition moment where I was like, oh my God, someone else thinks this. And it was really lovely. But yeah, I mean, I guess, just to kind of weigh in on sort of why I was very keen to sort of, essentially center this event around some of Rabz's concerns, is that while I personally have been very grateful for instances in which like kind of seeing someone or seeing something has made me aware that something is possible, for example, to like be Black, queer, and old, it's like I definitely remember like seeing that was possible and thinking, I hadn't thought that was possible. And so while that is, of value, and that does have the potential to sort of change a person, I feel like the other thing that's definitely really happening on the other hand is this very, like for me, really urgent kind of uncoupling that I believe needs to take place And that's between the idea that representation, whether it's on screen or indeed in a gallery space or what have you, or in an institution, this coupling between the idea that representation is a kind of indicator or an index of some sort of like progress or like wider social change. And I think we've just seen over and over again that that's not really the case. Or we've seen so many instances in which that is not the case that I feel like it is worth a discussion. And I guess for me, what's at stake in kind of inviting some people to kind of weigh in on this, of whom I really do believe that we've been able to get some of the best. I think what's at stake in kind of having this kind of discussion is I do think that there's this element in which conversations around representation are addressed from a point of lack, so like filling a lack or like filling a hole that has existed. Whereas, you know, again, on the other side, we've seen over and over that people of color, Black artists, have been living and making really amazing art for literally hundreds of years. People have been traveling the world. People have been filmed on screen doing the amazing things that they do, and that has been as long as the kind of medium itself. And so, actually, I would really challenge the fact that there is a sort of lack of availability or activity. And so, I'd like to kind of think about like. Yeah, for me, it would be very nice if we were able to sort of think about some of the other things other than kind of like narratives of lack or desires towards like a teleological process or progress as a reason for being concerned about representation. So I guess, yeah, what I hope for today, I understand that, you know, a lot of us have, or I guess kind of how I've invited folks to talk, and also what I'm sort of hoping for this conversation is that the understanding that sort of like a lot of us have already commiserated already, and I think that there should be some time for some joy and some pleasure in hearing what others are thinking, what they're working on, and where they stand. So I really invite you to kind of, you know, dig into what everyone is saying. And I hope that we've kind of structured the day that way. So basically, Rabz is gonna come up and speak in a minute. Then Rabz and I are gonna have a really quick conversation up here. Then we're gonna have a short break for people who want breathers, people who want water, who want to pee, people who want to collect their thoughts, like to marinate. Then Emma is gonna speak for a bit. Then Morgan is also gonna speak for a bit. Then Morgan and Ayo are gonna have a brief conversation, and I'll be introducing people. And then we'll have another short break after that, again, for more water, more peeing, more marinating. And then at that point, if all goes well, it'll be about 3:10 p.m. And we will then have like a wider discussion where all of us will kind of just like perch here, and then we can discuss amongst ourselves, in which we will have marinated and taken care of our urgent needs and just have a great conversation. So before I go on for much longer, I just wanted to introduce Rabz Lansiquot, who is a curator, a programmer, a DJ based in London. I'm not going to read much bio information because I know that's already been out. Rabz is a part of a collective called Sorry You Feel Uncomfortable, which is doing really amazing programming and exhibitions at the moment. And we kind of met and spoke a little bit about kind of Rab's dissertation research, actually, which is the inspiration for this whole thing. So, welcome, Rabz. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Taylor, and to everyone who invited me to be here and present this research, which I've kind of, as Taylor said, was initially part of my dissertation research about a year ago, and has kind of developed, and I've been thinking through it kind of on my own and in conversations with people for about a year, and literally this morning finished writing it down. And so basically what I'm going to talk about is kind of it's a combination of the dissertation research, which is based around Raoul Peck's I'm Not Your Negro, and around just some kind of more theoretical things that have been coming up for me recently. I'm primarily concerned with what is happening beyond the frame, or to invoke a Jamu X, what the work is doing. This is not meant to be in a pseudo-intellectual or actually intellectual way here. What I mean is quite literally, what impact does this work have on the world, on reality and on lived experience? As a black person, this question is always directly related to what impact the work has on the lives of black people. The central question, I suppose, is what can moving image practice do for black liberation? A representational approach seeks to do anti-racist work through heightened visibility first and foremost. We must be seen to be understood or to understand ourselves. Then it concerns itself with positive or useful representations. We must see ourselves how we want to be seen in order to become that, and we must be seen by others the best that we can be. The idea is that with more positive, in some cases, or accurate representation, black people's lives will be transformed, firstly, by the fact of white people seeing us positively, or more specifically, as humans, and secondly, by transforming our own consciousness and inevitably making us better. This idea is based on a foundation that I disagree with. Firstly, that we are not good already in the mutual debt that can never be made good, in Moton's words, or to rephrase that black people must align themselves to a particular set of values in order to be good enough. And secondly, that white people's opinions or understandings of who we are have some tangible effect on the qualities of our lives or our ability to live them. It is not the moral compass of white people that will save us. The structure of anti-blackness and the foundations of white supremacy goes far deeper than whether or not you have a good or bad opinion of me as a black person. In discourse around the moving image, in art and activism, to name a few spheres of influence, a disproportionate amount of black people's energy is spent or invested in trying to convince white people of our humanity. This is what Toni Morrison means when she says, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge it up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. So most people can understand the problematics of good representation, and there's been much work written about this. What I'm interested in is when black film has a liberatory intention to it, but is still within the realm of representation. That is concerned with an illusory white audience who is ready to see the truth about anti-blackness and join the fight for black liberation. What so often happens when black film aims to liberate is that the truth of anti-blackness, racism, or black life is shown as violence against black bodies. So instead of the good representation argument where the focus on showing good and happy black people, the focus becomes telling the reality of black life and showing it in all its violence, again to convince white audiences of our humanity. I want to give an example. Raoul Peck's I Am Not Your Negro is, in Zandria Robinson's words, punctuated by the nude body of Malcolm X, pictured from the shoulder up with the giant's mouth agape at the very beginning of the film. Casket photos of Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin. Photos of lynched bodies, their snapped necks and foaming mouths in clear view, grinning, vile, white mobs heaving, lynching, shoving, stopping the communist plot of desegregation, police batons rising, falling, and cracking onto black bodies without seizing, an indigenous woman stripped naked by white soldiers, an officer getting a running start to shove a nameless black woman to the ground, an extended look at the LAPD beating of Rodney King. When asked why he decided to include so many violent images in the film, Raoul Peck replied, "You have to show them the truth. I know it's a shock for most people, and I try to make it as short as possible, but at the same time, I want you to feel the violence. It's clear to me that this them he wants to show the truth to, and this you he wants to feel the violence, is not an audience of black people. We already know the truth, whether we acknowledge it or not. It is a white audience who needs to be convinced that we have suffered." In James Baldwin's The Devil Finds Work, he speaks about a key scene in the 1958 film The Defiant Ones, which illustrates the complexities of racialized affect when confronted with the moving image. In the scene, a black man and a white man, played by Sidney Poitier and Tony Curtis respectively, are on the run to escape the chain gang. Poitier's character Noah manages to jump on board a passing freight train and is unable to pull John, played by Curtis, on board. He then proceeds to jump off the moving train, which would likely have gotten him to relative safety, joining his companion on the ground and in danger. Baldwin states that while liberal white audiences applauded Noah's actions, the black audience in the cinema where he saw the film in Harlem yelled, "Get back on the train, you fool." The Devil Finds Work asserts the necessity for the film scholar of a consideration that the embodied, socially grounded individual watching a film, what Baldwin refers to as the flesh and blood person. For black viewers of films, their personal and communal lived experience of anti-blackness informs this embodied spectatorship, which, when faced with explicit images of anti-black violence, manifests in divergently different experiences of the film to white audience. As a result, the lack of embodiment and of flesh and blood identification, the majority of white communities and spectators are able to distance themselves from the other, the dying black, and by way of what Frantz Fanon terms cognitive dissidence, and James Edler terms distancing behaviors from the violent individuals, and in turn the violent institutions, their violent institutions that commit the murders, or at least allow them to happen. The fast-paced, arresting use of violent imagery in I Am Not Your Negro, in contrast to the celestial imagery of Hollywood and government propaganda that it sits next to in the film, brings up the issue of the spectacular character of black suffering, the ways in which cinematic displays of black pain and black death become alluring points of voyeuristic fascination. Speaking on the aforementioned videoing and dissemination of racialized violence, Elmi asserts that while these are acts of defiance against our oppressors which document the realities of state-sanctioned brutality, they also become a readily available spectacle to live forever in infamy. Black theorists and writers in the academy and beyond have for a long time been critical of the uses of images of black bodies and black death and violence as a method of liberation. Robinson argues that Peck's point, his attempt at a consciousness shift in the film, is buried under the necrophiliac sexualization of black bodies. She asks, directly responding to Peck's employment of the juxtaposition, with killing this shocking, this jarring, this pleasurable, this thrilling, this grotesque, this climactic, who would want it to stop? This spectacle of black death in the film, alongside providing space for change on one hand, feeds the visual appetite for violence and brutality, particularly along racial lines. While there's been evidence in history that the dissemination of these images has contributed significantly to the activation of communities and the widespread resistance against it. However, we know that from the many cases of violence against black people that have been recorded, whether by CCTV or by bystanders on their smartphones, and then reproduced on social media, in Hollywood films and artist films, and in courtrooms, that seeing murder in no way just guarantees justice. In fact, I don't know if it ever has. This utilization of images of the black body in pain or black death for liberation comes with the problems of representation that may in fact be counterproductive, or more specifically contribute further to processes of dehumanization. Jennifer Nash suggests that the black body captured in the visual field is always called upon to do something, to produce a set of effective cultural and political results, to do something to alter a history and system of racial inequality that is in part constituted through visual discourse. She refers here to the expectation of black bodies to always produce labor, even inadvertently, a material and philosophical dynamic which many have argued has existed since the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, and before that probably, wherein blackness signifies servitude, objecthood, and fungibility. One of Saidiya Hartman's key questions in her seminal text Scenes of Subjection concerns what the exposure of the violated body yields and whether the pain of the other merely provides us with the opportunity for self-reflection. This us, I think she's speaking specifically about white people. Hartman asserts that only more obscure than the brutality unleashed at the whipping post is the demand that this suffering be materialized and evidenced by the display of the tortured body or endless recitations of the ghastly and terrible. She states that the consequences of this routine display of the black ravaged body are rarely liberatory, and that the casualness with which scenes of brutality against the black body are circulated don't incite indignation. Instead, they immure us to pain by virtue of their familiarity, and especially because they reinforce the spectacular character of black suffering. Hartman here alludes to the precariousness of empathy as it relates to black people's experiences of oppression and violence. I follow her here in suggesting that the repeated display of such images in I Am Not Your Negro and in a bunch of other artist films, including Arthur Jafer's work, and I could go on a crazy list, undermines the intention of putting to an end this plague against a community or even cultivating empathy within those in power. So visually representing the truth of anti-black violence, that is, the truth of black life, does hardly anything to combat that violence or even to address it in any meaningful way. Not for black people as we already live it, and not for white people because, well, we're still unsafe, at risk, and in danger at their hands. Representing the truth, then, is not enough. This is an issue I wrestled with in my MA thesis, which was focused on I Am Not Your Negro, and its many problematics, and as well as in this series of images you see projected. It's a reframing of a piece called Where Did We Land, which I made earlier this year for an exhibition at Glasgow International Festival, which was called But What Are You Doing About White Supremacy? It was initially, these images were initially printed on acetate and hung along the space, and you could kind of move around them, and they kind of were obscured in some way. I've kind of made it into, I guess, a filmic piece to kind of illustrate my point, and also this is kind of like a a work in progress that I'm trying to work with. I'm thinking about making it into an actual film, I guess. So these images are all of things that relate in some way to anti-black violence or to the effect of white supremacy on black people. And I attempted to obscure the images in some way, to point to the violence, to face it and be attentive to it, but not to allow it to be a spectacle. I don't know if I succeeded. I don't think I really did, but this is essentially a visualization of all these complicated feelings that I'm speaking about here, about representing blackness and anti-black violence, and about liberation in the image. In order to create films that are generative in the lived world and have an effect on the liberation of all black people, we have to engage in a moving image practice beyond the realm of representation. Seeing myself reflected on screen humanly as a black queer person in particular would be nice. Maybe it would make me feel affirmed and boost my self-esteem somehow, but it won't get us all free. The inspired white members of the audience who enthusiastically applauded at the end of I Am Not Your Negro, and those who gawked at the projections of the walls of the Serpentine Sackler during Arthur Jafer's exhibition, to name just 2 examples, were not inspired enough to fight for my freedom in any transformative way. That process doesn't end in the viewing. So I wonder, and these are a bunch of questions that I'm wrestling with and I have no answers to them, and I don't think that we or anyone ever will, but they're things that I really think are important to ask. What does the black moving image practice look like if it foregrounds the rigorous work needed for black liberation? If it is actively attentive to the doing work? How do these questions expand the possibilities of black filmmaking? How do they expand the capacity of black film to act as a tool? How does this alter how we view black moving image and moving image in general? How does this change what we're looking for? Instead of asking, do I see myself here, or how will they see me as a result? What happens when we ask, what does this mean for my freedom? I most certainly do not have the answers, and I do think that they're essential to ask. Essentially, I believe representation will not get us free, and I'm trying to work out what will. Thank you.
Okay, so basically I've got 3 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it important for you for black film to be a tool?
I think for me, I'm a person that can't ignore like the world that we live in and the ways that like being a black person in this world is like painful every day in a lot of ways. And I'm like, I have a sensibility, like an activist sensibility, but not like the energy to be an activist, if that makes sense. So, and like I'm interested in the moving image, and I feel like the moving image is a space where I could do something. And it's a space where like, you know, the very first feature film, right, is Birth of a Nation, and the like fact of Birth of a Nation is like why the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses. Like that happened after the film. Like the effect that a film can have is really profound. But I think that black filmmakers are kind of we tend to be trapped in like kind of circles where we are worried about like representing ourselves, representing the whole community, all of these things that like stop us from being able to just make the work that we want to make or make work that's actually going to make change.
Is that like, is that an end, like this work that we might be able to make, is that, are you talking about a process of like pleasure in making work that you don't feel like is there, or?
I think pleasure, like in this case I was talking about the use of violent imagery and like what it does. But like this research is also about things like form, how we film each other, how we organize time in film, like all of these different things that we're unable to kind of experiment with as much as like the average white filmmaker or white artist moving image kind of person, because we have to like first and foremost like think about like if I like film a black person doing drugs, am I like feeding into like, you know, it's like stuff like that I always like find really frustrating.
Why do black filmmakers have to think about that?
I don't think we.
I mean,
have
I'm
to.
like you know what I'm saying, I'm being a bit pedantic.
Yeah. Because like even within ourselves, we expect so much of each other. I remember seeing Moonlight, and one of the first critiques I heard of it was like, oh, why are we seeing like another ghetto story? And I was just like, that's not what I saw. But that's the standard that we hold each other to, is like we have to, in order for anything to be valid or be liked, we have to like fit a certain amount of good representation into it. And that's like both because like the like white film industry won't pay attention to certain things, but it's also because we hold each other to a particular standard that I think a lot of other communities don't necessarily hold each other to, because there's a lot of work to be done.
Do you feel like you can sort of, or I'm imagining that you can, and so I'm asking you to talk about instances in which like that level of expectation like wasn't placed upon you as a black filmmaker, or like you witnessed it not being placed upon a film, and then basically like what happened?
I don't think I've ever made anything that wasn't thinking about that. I've always tried to be like, I don't make films with like white audiences in mind like that, but like that's always a factor whether you want it to be or not. Like all the films I've made, I would say that like all of this idea, like I haven't put it into practice really, but all the films I've made, I don't know, they've like there's been a voice in two voices in my head, one being what is this saying to other people, and one being what is this saying to black people, which is still important to think about, but it's also a trap.
Okay, so my second question is, so you spoke a bit in your talk about sort of like films that desire, so for example, the Raoul Peck film and some other examples that like desire to communicate a truth in order to like change a mind, which is like assumed to be a white mind, which I think is also like a very interesting assumption, but maybe we can come back to that later. What would be the end then of a film like the one that you're working on now, if not to like communicate a truth or change a mind?
This one, what I wanted to do was like kind of play with opacity, and like, so a lot of the images are images that if you're a black person who's interested in like liberatory work, you'll be like, I know exactly who that is, or like I know exactly what that image is, or and it just that by that small kind of snippet, and it's just like a reference to those people, and then it's also like for me it's like more of a process. I don't think that I can get to that end point. I think that it's going to take like a lot of work and a lot of like different minds in order to get to that point. But I guess what I was trying to do with this was just like think about it. Like similarly with the talk, it's just some questions, because we don't have answers to them, and like I don't have answers to them. So it's just like thinking through it.
A final question. You mentioned Ajamu at the beginning of your talk, who I think has been referenced quite a bit and quite beautifully in like recent months, in various people's works. What does Ajamu's work mean for your freedom?
I think Ajamu is just like Ajamu's work is representational in that it's like
That's why I asked.
Yeah, like this is some black queer people, right? And but I think what is liberating about Ajamu's work is that Ajamu is not trying to like throw up some images of some black queer people and be like, look, we exist, like we are here. He's trying to document something, or he sees what I see in the community, and like what I see in the people that I know, and some of which have been photographed by him. Like he's not looking for to just like take an image and then like parade it around and tell white people that we exist. He's like trying to document something that's like actually real.
Like what? You don't have to speak
I don't
about
know.
all, but like
I don't know what it is, but I think he's just like so in the quote that I used, which was like, what does the work do, is like something he just is concerned with. Is like what is it doing? It's not just about like being like, oh, this is here. It's also about, you know, what effect does that happen on a black queer person who sees it? What effect does that have on an emotional level? I think more than anything, and that's why I find his work interesting. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. Thanks, Rabz.